partition is illegal, it'll never be recognised. The signature by institutions and individuals of the partition is invalid. It will not bind the Jewish people. Jerusalem was and will forever be our capital. Eretz Israel will be restored to the people, all of it, and forever. So these are the attitudes of the leadership. We have a distinguished statesman. Okay, this is where the story becomes very dramatic, because on the 14th of May, Ben Gurion, under a photograph of Herzl, declares the state of Israel. The day before the expiration of the mandate, the British mandate, he declared the state of Israel as a Jewish state, and the newspaper runs the headline. And Avi Shlaim talks about this, because what happened, interestingly, with the expiry of the mandate and the proclamation of the state of Israel, 7 Arab states sent their armies into Palestine. Now, by the way, I'm reading what is the official story. This is what Avi Shlaim is going to show is false in every respect. This is quite extraordinary, because we all, including me, thought this was just the way the story went. Let me just sum it up in my own words. Poor little Israel, this fledgling state, was established by the Jews, and all the Arab armies invaded to kill this infant in its crib. That's the story. And he reports this, and he says, this account was that they sent their armies into Palestine with the intention of strangling the Jewish state at birth. The subsequent struggle was an unequal one between a Jewish David and an Arab Goliath. It's completely wrong. The idea that the Jews were outnumbered is factually false, and you can read the details in Avi Shlaim's book. I can give you some of the details. And of course, the idea that this was a miracle was no miracle. At each stage of the war, this is quoting from Schlein, at each stage of the war, the idea of significantly outnumbered, all the Arab forces arrayed against it. By the final stage of the war, its superiority ratio was nearly 2 to 1. So the Jewish armies were much stronger, much better equipped, because they had imported extra arms from Czechoslovakia and elsewhere. And the final outcome of the war was therefore not a miracle, but a reflection of the underlying Arab-Israeli military balance. It was always so, and has been ever since. One of the interesting facts about this period is the war broke out on the 15th of May. That was the day after the state was declared. By then, by the 14th and 15th of May, there had already been massacres and ethnic cleansing on a very large scale. It's not as though the Arabs just invaded and then during the war atrocities happened. The atrocities were happening and the ethnic cleansing was going on, most notoriously the Deir Yassin on April 9th. This is well before, a month before the outbreak, before the 14th of May. By the 15th of May, 380,000 Palestinians had become refugees. They had expelled them already. So this is why the war broke out. It wasn't just that they invaded the fledgling state of Israel for no reason. And of course, these are the notorious pictures of the Palestinians fleeing. Very well-known pictures. Now, I'm going to quote something that's very interesting at the time. This is a letter to the New York Times, signed by some notable people: Hannah Arendt, Albert Einstein, Zelig Harris was a linguist who was actually Chomsky's teacher. Sidney Hook was a famous philosopher. I don't know too many of the other names. They're all Jews. They signed this extraordinary letter in 1948, and I'll just indicate bits of it. They're talking about Begin's party, which was the forerunner of Likud, the Herut party. A political party closely akin in its organisation, methods, and political philosophy and social appeal to the Nazi and fascist parties. This is very interesting and revealing. The whole letter is in this vein. A shocking example was their behaviour in the Arab village of Deir Yassin. This village, off the main roads and surrounded by Jewish lands, had taken no part in the war, had even fought off Arab bands who wanted to use the village as their base. So this was a village that wasn't combatants or
like
in any form creating hostilities. And they invaded and did a terrible massacre there. I don't know how many hundreds were just massacred, men, women and children. Anyway, it talks about the corpses, and Deir Yassin was the incident which exemplifies the character and actions of this Freedom Party. And within the Jewish community, they preached an admixture of ultra-nationalism, religious mysticism, and racial superiority, like other fascist parties that have been used to break strikes and so on. This is very revealing in retrospect, because they were the forerunners of the Likud party and so on, and it's not exactly as though these attitudes have not persisted. I won't read further from the letter. Well, the Nakba, which is the Palestinian Arabic word for the catastrophe, PinP says the ethnic cleansing of 1948 is the most formative event in the modern history of the land of Palestine. It's been almost entirely eradicated from the collective global memory and erased from the world's conscience. The Israelis are very sensitive and nervous about it. As much as this is coming out, they even closed some of the files where the historians revealed a lot of this stuff in the archives. Some of the documents are very telling, and the Israelis actually closed those files down to some extent. So it's an interesting story. And the newspapers are reporting this now increasingly. Burying the Nakba, how, this is in the Israeli newspaper, by the way, in Haaretz. Burying the Nakba, how Israel systematically hides evidence of 1948 expulsion of the Arabs. So this is a very interesting story. I won't go into much detail. Again, in Haaretz, classified documents reveal massacres of Palestinians in 48. They just discovered some of the extra information about Tantura, a massacre that occurred and so on. This is coming out. And of course the story of the refugees, we all grew up with the story that the leaders told them to flee and so on. It's all rubbish. And the idea that it was a product of war. Benny Morris has started to claim that the refugees were the fog of war and so on. But there's lots of evidence that that's not true, and PinP is important in having shown that. And he says it's not that the Zionist movement in creating its nation waged a war that tragically but inevitably led to the expulsion of parts of the indigenous population from what we're already seeing. Rather, it's the other way around. The objective was the ethnic cleansing of the country. The movement coveted for its new state, and the war was a consequence and a means to carry it out. That's pretty clear, at least that's PinP's version, of course. And look, I'm going to try and not go in as much detail, but Plan D was the explicit military instructions to the leaders to do this ethnic cleansing. They had information from what we call the village files, where they had taken the hospitality of the leaders of the Palestinian villages and surveyed and recorded all of the details of every village, how many people, how many guns, how many cattle. And they used this, and it was a clear operational plan to destroy the villages by setting fire to them, blowing them up, and mounting search and control operations. And in the case of resistance, the armed forces must be wiped out and the population expelled outside the borders of the state, which is what happened to a large extent. Now again, I'm not going to go through this, I'm just throwing this up here so you see. In every item which was the official story, the historians are now contradicting it, which is what I'm trying to convey without giving like a year-long seminar here. It's important to understand that the narrative that we all had is seriously challenged, and if you don't like it, as most of the Jewish community won't like it, and people who are brought up on the myths like I was, you have to then do your homework and go and read up and find out and make up your own mind. So I'm trying to give you some account of the alternatives. Let me indicate what are the uncontroversial facts. That was at the partition where the Palestinians were owned, that was land ownership, and as I said, the Jews only owned 6%. Afterwards they got 55%. But after the war, they expanded, of course, so now the Jews had 78%. Each one of those black dots is a former Palestinian village which was obliterated, wiped off the map. Nearly 500 Palestinian villages were obliterated, and the JNF grew trees all over them. The Jewish National Fund disguised their existence. And to this day, there are traces there. If you travel around, you can see what's left. I'm going to show you them. One village, I took this photograph, a beautiful village which preserved just outside of Jerusalem, is Lifta. And they all look like this. This is controversial into what they're going to do, but it's a beautiful place, what's left of it. Ben Gurion, he said, now this is why the early leadership were extremely interesting. They were so candid. He said, look, if I was an Arab leader, I'd never make terms with Israel. It's natural. We've taken their country. This is Ben Gurion, he's saying, we've taken their country. Sure, God promised it to us. Of course, he doesn't believe that. But what does it matter to them? Our God is not theirs. We come from Israel. It's true. But 2,000 years ago, and what's that to them? There has been anti-Semitism, the Nazis, Hitler, Auschwitz, but was that their fault? This is the sort of thing that I might say, it's like indicating that, what's the justification for all this? They see only one thing, we've come here and stolen their country. Why should they accept that? This is Ben Gurion himself. No Zionist leader speaks this way today. And there's the famous Moshe Dayan. He gave this in a speech to university students somewhere. He said, we came to this country which was already populated by Arabs, and we're establishing a Hebrew, that is a Jewish state here. Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. You do not even know the names of the Arab villages, and I don't blame you, because these geography books no longer exist. Not only do the books not exist, the Arab villages are not there either. There's no one place built in this country that did not have a former Arab population. Well, that's Moshe Dayan, the great hero. Okay, quickly, to go through it in a ridiculous haste through the history of this, but again to indicate the alternative narrative that I think has to be understood by people who don't already know, as many of us do. What about the 67 war? Again, as I joked earlier on, to my friend, one of us is wrong about everything. Well, the 67 war isn't the way we all thought either. The idea that Nasser was threatening to take over in another, Holocaust, it turns out that the historical evidence is quite contrary to that. It's not like that at all, and that's accounted for by the scholar John Quigley, and in fact Miko Peled, who's an interesting and important character. His father, Matityahu Peled, was one of the senior generals at the time in 67, and he tells the story. And here's I think this is from Quigley. He says, the four major powers all knew that the Arab states were not in attack mode. The major powers tried feverishly to dissuade Israel from attacking, but here's what's most revealing. Begin himself, I can give you the reference to this if you're interested, he said in a speech somewhere that all of the wars, Lebanon in 82, later, Sinai and 67, they were wars of choice designed to achieve political objectives. The Israelis knew that Nasser wasn't going to invade. I mean, he was saber rattling and making stuff. You can read the accounts. I'm trying to sketch the extent to which every episode in this history is quite contrary and damning of what we all grew up thinking. It's not a nice story. Well, the peace process. That's a euphemism and a myth, and you can read about it from Rashid Khalidi, and in fact, the Israeli, I met her in Israel, Tanya Reinhardt, and of course Chomsky. This is one of the most important works on how the entire peace process has been a fraud. The idea that, it's always the Arabs that are intransigent and unwilling and so on, it's all rubbish. And the Oslo Agreement was the cause of the current mess. Again, it was celebrated as a great advance, but look what happened. There's Arafat, of course, shaking hands. Edward Said wrote a shocking and really quite extraordinary article immediately afterwards. It's called The Morning After. And I won't be able to read it to you, but I'll read you a couple of quotes. He says, let us call the agreement by its real name, an instrument of Palestinian surrender. He's very critical of Edward Said, of Arafat. And look at some of the things he said. I will read out some of these because it's very revealing. He called it an instrument of Palestinian surrender. He says the truly astonishing proportions of the Palestinian capitulation were the distinctive features of this. He refers to the degrading spectacle of Yasser Arafat thanking everyone for the suspension of most of his people's rights. Arafat gave away a lot of concessions which the Israelis had already made. He actually betrayed the Palestinian cause. Israel had conceded nothing, as former Secretary of State James Baker had said in a TV interview, except blandly the existence of the PLO as representative of the Palestinian people, until Oslo international consensus supported complete Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza, and the right of the Palestinians to an independent state. The crucial concession of the PLO is in effect to grant legitimacy to Israel's pretense of possessing existing rights in the West Bank and Gaza. And now, as we know, the West Bank and Gaza become disputed territories. Well, they weren't disputed until Arafat allowed the Israelis to claim that. And in fact, I can't resist referring to the way in which the conversation went here. Brandis came along and decided Australia back then should drop the use of the word occupied. So I made a joke on Facebook. From now on we can't use the word. Well, I'm just being a smart ass. But the serious point is that that's how the dialogue changed at the time. Well, recently, this was just from the Sydney Festival boycott, Colin Rubinstein, the great leader of the lobby organisation, private lobby organisation, he said the Palestinian leaders have rejected 3 Israeli comprehensive peace proposals over the past 2 decades that would have realised the creation of a Palestinian state on practically all the land of the West Bank. It's not true. None of it is true. They keep saying this. The myth of the two-state solution. Well, as a result of the Oslo Agreement, let me indicate to you how deeply entrenched was the quite alternative view you've now seen. Nobody mentioned over the years, when all of the leadership around the world here, the Jewish leadership and Zionists would say, we support a two-state solution. They didn't make a peep over the years when the settlers were taking over the whole of the land, but nobody mentioned that the Likud Charter was quite explicit about this. The Jordan River will be the permanent eastern border of the State of Israel. The government of Israel flatly rejects the establishment of a Palestinian Arab state west of the Jordan River. Jerusalem's the eternal capital. Judea and Samaria, the realisation of Zionist values, blah, blah, blah. This is absolutely explicit. They had no intention of it, never had an intention of making a Palestinian state. What was all the pious rhetoric about two states on behalf of the... I'm giving a wind-up signal. Let me just speed through quickly some of the things I would have said. I wanted to indicate what the mess is now on the West Bank. The West Bank is now a bunch of cantons that are not viable. There's not a viable state there. And the myth of generous Israeli offers is just that. I can show you the references for Camp David subsequently, not only the Oslo Agreement. They were all kind of a fraud that have been well documented. And the myth of Israel's generous offer, I'm going to just whip through my slides to indicate what deserves a lot more discussion, given the time. If you bear with me just a few more minutes, I'm going to rush forward to some of the things that I haven't talked about yet, and which is quickly through, if I've got a few more minutes, the situation in Palestine today, which is very important. Quickly, there have been 3 reports on the apartheid situation now. It was talked about, but now the B'Tselem, the Israeli organisation, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty have come out, and it's very interesting to understand the shortcomings of this. I'll quickly talk about this. The shortcomings are to do with the fact that you have to distinguish Israel proper behind the 67 barrier, the armistice line. The West Bank is much worse than apartheid, much worse. It's a brutal military occupation. I'm going to show you some hints of that. And the Gaza is even worse. So that has to be understood in terms of what's going on today as a result of this ongoing process. Now, forgive me for skipping through these. These are the reports by the organisations. By the way, Human Rights Watch says a threshold crossed. Well, it was crossed a long time ago. It wasn't just recently. And of course, Amnesty even says that. It goes back to 48 in the ways I've indicated. Let me rush through and ignore Zionist responses. They're just plain denial. They're just simply in denial. Particularly Greg Sheridan. You know, it's all rubbish, disgusting. It's all just... Interestingly, even Jimmy Carter came out and he said it has nothing to do with what's going on inside Israel, which is a wonderful democracy. Well, it's not true. In Haifa, there's a group, an NGO called Adala, which has documented 50 or 60 laws that are discriminatory long before even the nation-state law came out in 2018, which is explicitly an apartheid rule that the Jews are the ones entitled to self-determination and not the Palestinians. All right. Again, I won't read it. Ariel Sharon was quite explicit. The reason that the founding document of Israel doesn't talk about democratic states is because they have no intention of making a democratic state. And the Palestinian right of return is rejected. Of course, they invented the Israeli law of return for Jews. I have more rights than my Palestinian friends. You know, I'm from Jews in Europe. Let me go through this. The Jewish National, I can't resist mentioning this, I've got an interesting personal stake in this. The Jewish National Fund is an organisation that basically, to put it briefly, is the institution for expropriating Palestinian land. That's basically what it's about. You can read it in more detail if you like. But here's the part that's interesting for me. This was the Australian, and one of my friends in the audience will know who this is. This was my mother's cousin in Australia, a guy called Steve Gerstle. He was the federal head of the JNF for decades. And there he is with Ben Gurion. So he was a big shot. And there's a picture of me with him when I was a kid. So I have an interesting personal stake in this story. So let me rush through. This is what Israel looks like today. This is a rally recently where the Jews in Israel are running around with their flag in occupied East Jerusalem, yelling anti-Arab slogans. The Arab is the son of a bitch. You'll end up at refugee camps. And this guy says, the second Nakba is coming. This is what Israel looks like. This was an earlier rally. They're constantly yelling Ma'avet al-Arabim, which means kill the Arabs. This is sadly the way it looks. And they do it for our benefit in English. Kill them all. Well, let me quickly run through. Forgive me, have I still got a bit more time? Oh, okay, I'll try.
You need questions.
I know, because I need the question time. I just wanted to get through some of the important bits. This claims, some document claims, there's no occupation in the West Bank. Well, I've taken a lot of these photos myself. That's when you walk down from Damascus Gate. What no occupation? Let me just run through the photographs. Tell me if this looks like no occupation. This is, I took that shot in Bil Ayin, where we were attacked by the Israelis up the hill there. This is in Hebron. Does this look like no occupation? This is a still from a video where the Israelis shot at some kids, and he's jubilant that he hit one of them. This is, and the headlines are the deadliest years for kids. Kids are being shot dead in the West Bank. This is a video of some snipers shot dead, 2 kids walking with their backpack doing nothing. I'm just going to run through these photographs of recent kids that have been shot dead. And DCI International is recording the number of kids that are being shot dead. It's on average 2 a week. These are children, not counting all the others that are being shot dead. This is what it looks like under occupation for children. These are kids, and you can see, that's the Mr. Arabim, by the way. These are Israelis that put the keffiyeh on, and then they grab kids and they put their Israeli thing on. They're really undercover Israelis. That's what it looks like in the West Bank. So the idea that there's no occupation, this is not apartheid. That's house demolitions. I took that picture. This is house demolitions in the middle of the night. I'm just going to run through this slide so you can see for yourself. That's a fridge with the family photos on it. The wall has been declared illegal by the International Court of Justice. The water has been stolen. The Arabs have to have, the Palestinians have to have black tanks to save their water because it's stolen for the settlements. Hebron is a complete disaster where it's all locked down. That's what Hebron looks like. That's a road in Hebron. I took these pictures myself. And the idea that there's no occupation, that's the Ibrahimi Mosque where they simply storm through there with their boots on, no headdresses. East Jerusalem is being taken over, of course, increasingly. And in fact, Jerusalem now extends out almost to Jericho. I mean, that's the old city there, and that's the armistice line. They've just basically expanded. That's what it looks like. So let me rush to the end. There's the wall and the illegal declaration. That's what the crossings look like. The sign says, that's me with my wife, it's dangerous to your life to go into the West Bank and into Area A. It's not dangerous. I rigged this deliberately. I'm in the middle of Palestine somewhere there with some tough-looking Palestinians having a shave, and I joked that I thought for a moment, the razor is on my throat, and I thought this might be my last moment in Palestine. They knew I was a Jew. I was introduced as a Jew. I did this deliberately for a joke because, look, you know, it's not dangerous at all. And that's what a settlement looks like. That's settlements, the growth of the settlement numbers. That's the Hebron Hills. There's some poor little village, Susia, where the IDF come and destroy their water system, the solar panels. That's Susia. All right, I'm going to wind up. I was going to talk about Gaza, but I'll just say one or two words about Gaza. Gaza is not free of Israeli control. It's a myth that they left. According to Yoram Dipstein, it's under belligerent military occupation. They control everything that's going on in Gaza. I won't talk about it, but I was going to talk about the extent to which the wars were provoked, of course, by the Israelis. And this is what the Israelis had lined up against the Palestinians, who only have their little pissy rockets. Now, the rockets are a crime of international law, they're indiscriminate, but that's what the Israelis throw at Gaza, and that's what they end up looking like. Gaza looks like that. This is quite horrifying if you haven't seen these pictures. These were civilian residential areas. The idea that they used pinpoint targeting of their military equipment is demonstrably a lie. Until you see these pictures, you don't know that.
Lift your finger.
I spoke to one person. I was giving a talk in Malaysia to Palestinians, a lot of Palestinians there. One of them told me his family are under the rubble here in Shujaia. This is a suburb of Gaza City. Well, that's what it looks like. Let me just wind up now completely. The question is whether
Lift your hand.
whether we are supporting, in this case, soldiers shooting unarmed kids and others. They're lined up as snipers on Gaza. I had an Israeli a few months ago tell me, we don't have snipers shooting at people in Gaza. I don't know what he's talking about. And this is what the Gazans have in response. And in fact, of course, they shot that young nurse, they shot a guy in a wheelchair, and what they have in response is incendiary terror kites and condoms, condom balloons, but Israel responds with that. Well, I think that's what the refugees look like.
Lift your hand.
And Arabs look like this rather than terrorists. And perhaps that's a good point, Tim. Thank you.
Look, Peter, you've given, in sort of 40 minutes, you've given us a 12-week seminar, and I'm sorry if I looked as though I was going to hurry you through, but let's take questions from the floor. First question, yeah.
My question is, how do you think people should respond to allegations of anti-Semitism when they're criticising Israel, given that every moment that you spend defending an allegation or even talking about anti-Semitism is a moment that you're not talking about what's going on in Palestine, in Masafah Yatta, in Sheikh Jarrah, in Simran?
It's a very good. Your point is extremely important for the following reason. Firstly, the charge of anti-Semitism is a bullshit charge, and it's intended to simply divert attention from what's going on. And it distracts you because then you have to defend yourself impossibly against the charge that you're anti-Semite. And really the only thing to say is, yes, so I'm an anti-Semite, and let's talk about your atrocities. Let's not talk about me, let's talk about what you're doing. That's what they do, and it's a standard technique. The leadership here in the Zionist organisations, they just spray that accusation at anybody, as I mentioned the case, but it's not the only one. So you're right, it's a tough one because you can't actually prove you're not an anti-Semite. But if the only criterion is that you've criticised, let me give you one answer. Criticising India doesn't mean you're anti-Hindu. Criticising, you know, I don't know...
The American government.
No, but I'm picking countries where they have a national religion, as it were. You know, criticising, I don't know, Turkey doesn't mean you're anti-Muslim. So that's the sort of answer, because it's just a way of avoiding talking about what are the facts. Let's talk about the facts, not about my psychoanalysis.
Okay, next question. Your question.
It was a huge dilemma, wasn't it, the acceptance of
Can you
Jews?
speak up a bit, please?
It was a huge dilemma for the acceptance of Jews into Palestine before the Second World War. But all those people would have died, wouldn't they? So surely the problems have been since it was good that Palestine accepted those Jewish refugees, wasn't it? Like your relatives?
Look, it's a tough one to ask. Was it good that they accepted all refugees? Why did they have to go to Israel, Palestine? I mean, there was a problem. The refugees, my family were part of that. The Palestinians shouldn't have paid the price for what the Nazis did, which they have been paying ever since.
Yeah.
And that's the obvious point. Look, I always joke, the Jews should have been given Germany. I mean, I'm joking, you know, who was responsible for the Holocaust? Why were the Palestinians having to pay the price for it? They had absolutely no excuse for that. And all this mythology about, you know, the Jews returning to their ancestral home, it's all bullshit. But even if it's true, even if I had a direct genetic line, I've argued this quite a lot. Let's say, hypothetically, I had a direct DNA line back to Moses. What? That's why I made the joke about the Romans the Italians taking back England. What's that got to do with it?
No, that's something different. This was the ones that were escaping Nazism.
Yeah.
It was wrong after the war, but what was the alternative for those poor people trying to escape before?
It's a good question. Look, I don't have an answer for how to solve the refugee problem from the Second World War. I've got a very clear understanding that the Palestinians didn't have to pay the price for it. That's just obvious.
The other countries wouldn't take them.
Well, that's true too. America didn't take them. You know, the stories about the ships that are sailing around the world and they're not being accepted. The whole world had some responsibility for this. So all I'm saying is that Palestine is a disaster because of that. And the mythology that was created, that whole Exodus movie and the story, it's all a complete fabrication. You know, the theme song of that movie, of Exodus, is, this land is our land, God gave this land to me. Excuse me? Well, that was the story we all grew up with.
I mean, I suppose the issue is really, migrating to Palestine is one thing, but migrating to an apartheid state that is intent on obliterating a whole people, that's of a totally different order. That's what the issue is. Any more questions? Yeah, sure. Go for it. Gentleman over there, and then Vivi.
This Peter quoted Rashid Khalidi in the 100 Years War on Palestine. He accepts his family of Palestinian patriots that fought the fight for Palestinian freedom and self-determination. He's written a book on the development of Palestinian peoplehood. But at the concluding chapter of the 100 Years War on Palestine, after he's accepted the settler colonial prism for looking at it, he doesn't diminish the Nakba, he doesn't diminish the Naksa. He says to his own people, and I don't presume to speak to Palestinians and tell them what they should do, but he says there will be no peace between the Jordan and the sea until both sides recognize that given all the history, given all the suffering, given all the deceit, there are now two peoples with claims between the Jordan and the sea, and there will be no peace until each recognises the full right of the other to self-determination. Do you disagree with that?
I 100% agree with you. In fact, not only did Rashid Khalidi say that, I haven't finished reading that new book of his, Edward Said, you can see in an interview, he also said the same thing. That's no doubt that the Palestinians have long, and that's why even Hamas has been willing to make a peace with the Israelis on the 67 UN 242 basis. The Palestinians have long accepted the loss of the majority of historic Palestine. But you're quoting the Palestinians' willingness, and the question is, it's not symmetrical. The power and the whole political situation. I want to hear the Jewish leaders talk that way. The Israeli leaders and the Jewish communities pressing the Jewish leadership to make the same acknowledgement. My problem, the reason I'm getting up on the soapbox and belly aching about this is that the problem is not on the Palestinian side. It's on the other side. Who's holding, and the Americans are funding this to this tune of $3.8 billion a year. The solution, if you want a solution, I agree with what you said. Where do we point to this? Where do we act, if we're going to be active on this, where do we direct our efforts and our concerns? It's not at the Palestinians. They're not all good. I'm not saying the Palestinians are blameless. But the power, the entire situation depends entirely on the Americans and on the Israelis. That's not controversial. Or do you not agree with that?
No, I think there's huge asymmetry of power, and Israel has a preponderance of power. But the Palestinians have also got things to do. I mean, they say themselves...
What would you recommend? We're not Palestinian, you're right to say it's not for us, but we are agents in this. What would you recommend the Palestinians do? One, I didn't get to because I'm talking too long, the boycott movement. I happen to support the boycott. What else can they do? When they abandon violence and they resort to worldwide peaceful protest, they're accused of being anti-Semites. What can the Palestinians do? It's not up to them, you know what? It's up to us. My view is that we're the ones that are responsible for making this change. The Palestinians are incapable of fixing it. Look, it's like other examples. The East Timorese depended on the Western powers to help solve their problem. They weren't. I don't know if you agree with me on this. I don't think you do.
Okay, Lily?
Yeah, Peter, thanks very much for a terrific presentation, really. Thanks very much for a terrific presentation that covers it so well. What do you think the role is of Jewish activists in the Palestinian solidarity? I mean, what are our responsibilities?
As you can see, my view, very strongly held view, I'm proud of having spent with you a long time fighting this. Our direct, most important responsibility is to act within the Jewish communities where we have a voice, we have some grounds to be heard, we have a right to be heard, and that's why I played up the rhetoric of, the self-hating Jew nonsense. I mean, why are the leadership of the Jewish communities more important to listen to that talk through their ass than many others? By the way, I should say something that you know this well as I do. The leadership are not representative of the majority of the Jews, especially in America. It's shifting. And Norman Finkelstein has a book some years ago now where he sums this up. He's talking about the Jews in America who are very progressive on everything else except of course, Palestine, but they're progressive in their politics. And his book is titled, They Know Too Much. They're starting to find out how bad the story is from the beginning. And their progressive values mean that they can no longer be uncritical supporters of whatever Israel is doing in their name. And so it's a really important question for me and you and other Jews. And it seems to me that we should stand in solidarity with the Palestinians to put pressure where we can, like on our own government. Mind you, this Albanese government is shocking on this. They've accepted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which includes you shouldn't criticise Israel because you're an anti-Semite, and they've accepted that BDS is also anti-Semitic. It's shocking.
Well, it always seems...
Can you just speak more?
It's always seems strange to me that I've taught in Jewish schools. I'm not Jewish, but there's an incredible level amongst the students when they talk about Arabs of like hatred, and they do these really horrible cartoons of them and all this, and a lot of them go to do their national service in in Israel. Now, who else does that? If you know what I mean, this is why have they got the bomb? Where, you know, are they going to use it on the Arabs or like Palestine, or are they planning to sort of increase their territory? I mean, it's all pretty strange, and the suppression of information in files. I wonder if there's any danger of sort of destruction of that.
Look, on the question of schools, I think the Jewish community needs to start to open up to alternative opinions. They're very resistant to it, obviously.
Yeah, but why does Australia let them?
Well, it's not a matter of letting them. It's a question of the leadership and others have to simply face what is now a growing alternative account of the realities there.
But it's not. Italians don't go to Italy to do the national.
Well, it's a different situation. No, the Israel-Palestine situation is very different, and there, I mean, I think the Jewish communities are noticeably shifting, but it goes back to Vivian's question. It's our responsibility to help make that happen. But look, I don't give this talk often enough to Jewish organisations where we'd have the argument. I mean, that's why I started off by saying, you know, one of us is wrong. I have the arguments with our Jewish friends that are still willing to talk to me, but we've got a long way to go. I mean, Vivian does a great job in engaging with the Jewish community. I have to tell you that in my case, I spoke on a couple of occasions to the annual Jewish conference called the Limud Oz. I was banned from speaking there again because yeah, I gave a talk on Spinoza and other dissident Jews, but because I support the boycott movement. So you're not allowed to speak there if you have a view that crosses what they think is a red line. That's the battle that we have to shift. And I've heard Robin and others give wonderful talks in the Jewish community, and I admire and pleased to see that that's exactly where it's changing, because in the last thing was Robin spoke, Liam Getru spoke, who are leaders in the Jewish community, and they're saying the sort of things I would say. I didn't disagree with anything they said. So that's the way the shift is coming. And they have to also recognise that not everybody on the outside is an anti-Semite when they happen to be critical of what Israel does. We've got to undo that. And for people like me who have Holocaust background, it's the most disgraceful, shameful thing to accuse people of. When, by the way, I didn't get to BDS, I should put in a plug for that, but I mean, BDS is a human rights, international law-based movement, peace movement. Now, you may not agree with it, but to dismiss it as anti-Semitic, and in fact, compare it to the Nazis. Mind you, just while I'm on this, I was going to put up a slide to show that, you know, of the main targets of the BDS movement, Veolia, G4S, Caterpillar, Puma, not one of them are Jewish. So BDS is not against Jews because the targets are not Jewish. They're any organisation, not individual, profiting from the occupation. That's an admirable, we protest vodka from the Russians now. Suddenly it's okay to do BDS against the Russians. You can't have vodka anymore. Oh, okay.
Can I ask you a question, Peter? And it really is about, I mean, to digest the data you've given us this afternoon, you have to concentrate. And for you to have done so much to compile that presentation takes a lot of effort. The alternative is the lazy compliance with stereotypes, which, for example, the government persists with. It's easy to, if you're lazy, intellectually lazy, you just say, well, we'll pass the IHRA definition, or we'll say that there are two sides. There are not two sides, it's a complete imbalance, it's a nonsense. But there's a kind of laziness. You just take your cue from the front page of the Daily Telegraph. That's partly literal, partly metaphorical, because you don't have to think very much. And that's a real, in terms of our education, all of our mutual education, which ought to be exciting and interesting, the alternative is just to be lazy and say that the important thing really is whether there's a special in pork chops at Coles at the weekend.
Look, let me be a bit kinder to people. It's not no, it's not just lazy. The reality is, if you've got a life and you work and you come home in the evenings, I don't want to underestimate how difficult it is. That's why I started off by indicating how difficult it really is to come to terms with what your community believes, what everybody in the mainstream believes. I mean, the positions that I'm presenting are not just, for example, where the Jewish community is living in a bubble. The mainstream media don't show you the number of kids that are killed every day. You can't get a clear picture, but that's true of most of the things going on in the world. That's why I put Chomsky up in the manufacture of consent.
Right.
If you look at Latin America, you look at East Timor, you look at, I don't know, any number of things in the world that he's written about, we're all in the position. Now, it's very hard, and so, like you, I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I've been giving talks here and encouraging people, but most people aren't going to pick up one of Chomsky's books and read it from cover to cover. So, to be honest, I don't know what the answer is. I don't have a good answer to encourage people to read both sides. You sit around, a number of arguments I've had with people who are willing to talk about it, I always feel I can't pour into their head all of the facts. You may not accept them, but what I think are the relevant facts that they don't know. That's kind of a difficult exercise. So I really don't have a good answer to your question.
Well, I mean, we have to multiply the number of conversations.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's only through, I mean, I used to meet regularly with a bunch of pretty influential bankers, mostly, and I won't tell you where the cafes were, and they started off with a Palestinians terrorists, the Jews made the desert bloom kind of stereotype. It took about 4 or 5 breakfasts over several months, and because, as you know, both of us have been to Gaza 7 times and the West Bank more times than that, for these very bright, influential people to completely redefine what they understood. But it took, though, the conversations almost are sort of significant in any context.
You haven't argued with my Jewish friends. You try, the joke I made of being, I've had repeated arguments. It's very hard. I'm not blaming them in the sense that when you've grown up and you have a stake in an emotional state, you've got a framing. We're all in that position. There's some things which we find it very difficult to accept. It's a complete alternative. It's a difficult ask from people. So, yes, I think you're right though. Look, I think in some sense what I try to do is the facts in the end speak for themselves. If you don't know some of the relevant facts, how many kids, for example, let me give one example. If you think that Israel is defending itself, I didn't mention this as one of the key points. One of the standard lines is that Israel is defending itself. Nothing in the West Bank is for the defense of Israel. Shooting kids every week in the streets, the raiding and the demolishing of houses. I mean, I'm making a very blunt but absolutely correct answer. So once you start seeing the facts and ask them, how is it defending Israel to go raiding, houses in the middle of the night and dragging kids out and shooting them in the streets? It's about maintaining the occupation. So those facts start to undermine this mythology that they've all accepted for more or less good reasons. It's, the Jews have to look after themselves and all that stuff.
I'm going to have to go to another question. Somebody who's not had a question. Okay.
Peter, how is it going? How do you see it going forward from now? And where is it heading? That's one thing. The other thing, I'm a grandson of the Palestinian refugee who left Palestine in 1948 to Lebanon, right? The last thing my grandfather was telling me is that he was feeling stupid because he had the Jewish people, or he welcomed them in 1938 and 1935. That was his image of himself, right? Because he left Palestine, he stayed in a cave in Lebanon for 2 years till the United Nations or the UNRWA started to build camps and so on, and he suffered for 50 years. He didn't feel that he was stupid when he did it in Palestine, when he was helping whomever was coming from Europe, but he felt stupid because when he saw the grandsons and the sons of those people started bombing Palestinians, right? So that, and that's the discussion that I had with him 2 years before he died. The whole thing that was overwhelming his head is that I'm stupid.
Yeah, that's sad.
And he died feeling stupid.
What was the question actually though? What were you
The
asking?
first question, where do you see it
What's the
heading?
front? What's the future?
What's the future?
Look, I wish I could give you a simple answer because I can't. I mean, it goes back to partly what I was saying to Robin. The future politically depends on America. They are holding the strength and they're supporting what Israel continues to do. The question of one state, two state is still a live issue. As you know well, and I think I know very well, the problem of a compromise is not a problem on the Palestinian side. And I think that the problem is on the other side. The willingness, look, I mean, if you do a vox pop in Israel, it's shocking, the attitudes of the ordinary people. And I know among my own circles, I try to explain to my Palestinian friends, it's a bit embarrassing, I have to tell you. The worst attitudes, the racist, intolerant attitudes, I only hear on my side. And I'm very distressed by that because I don't think the Palestinians understand what they're up against. And if you move in the Jewish community, my friends will perhaps confirm that certainly that's widespread. They don't know, I mean, Gideon Levy is often pointing out, the Israelis don't know the stuff that I'm trying to point to, so they have to be better educated. They have to change the attitude that the Palestinians aren't all terrorists. That's why I put the last pictures up of nice Palestinians. You know, you only have to, and I made a joke about travelling in the West Bank as a Jew. Jews don't know that. They really don't. No, I get it. Okay, they've been brought up with this stuff. So I think attitudes are part of the problem. We've got to work on shifting that sense of understanding one another. Mind you, the Israelis made that very hard. When I was travelling there, it was very interesting. One Palestinian who was showing us around Nablus, he said that before the Intifada, he used to throw stones at the Israelis during the day, but in the afternoon he'd go to swim on Tel Aviv beach with his Jewish friends. That's not possible anymore. He made that point to say that the establishing personal relations with the Palestinians and the Jews is much harder. So that's one part of it. But politically, look, I think the two-state, one-state thing is a long conversation. Chomsky and others still think two states are possible. I don't know. I don't see how. But the problem is, on attitudes, the problem is Chomsky's view. I'm quoting him. The Israelis and the Jews around the world are not going to put up for these reasons, this attitude towards the Palestinians. Look how they treat the minority, the 20% that they've got currently in the country. What are they going to put up with? Equal rights to all Palestinians? It's not going to happen. In other words, the attitudes are such that they're so intolerant of even the 20% minority they've got. So realistically, if we're facing what we're up against, to insist that they simply give away all of their rights as a majority and now they're not going to do it. So we have to face these attitudes. How are we going to shift that? I don't have answers.
Would you give me the mic? Like Peter, I'm an atheist who's genetically and neurotically Jewish. I am a Zionist, but for me Zionism is simply the self-determination aspiration of the Jewish people, and it did not begin with Herzl. I can justify it, but that's not relevant now. What is relevant is, Peter, given the best of all possible worlds, can you envisage a solution which does not create a monstrosity like Lebanon is now?
Look, I don't know how to answer that. Lebanon is such a different situation, and there's little I know about that. You know, Israel-Palestine won't become Lebanon for all sorts of reasons. But for the reasons I was indicating, it's not clear how coexistence can happen easily or quickly. One solution, the path I was talking about with my Palestinian friends, I've got a wonderful friend who studied at New South Wales University under Hal Wooden's guidance. There's several Palestinian students. I visited him in Nablus. He's a professor of law there now. He used to argue for one state, but I said, look, first make two states that can make some sort of economic and other cultural relations with one another, and ultimately move to a binational state that was perhaps a long-term possibility. Frankly, I think that's the most likely way of easing the tensions and the mistrust and so on. So, look, it's not like Lebanon. Lebanon's too complicated for me. But one could see we have to change the attitudes and make steps towards. And by the way, one way, the problem is not just in Israel, it's in Palestine. It's being run by a bunch of crooks. The Palestinian Authority is in cahoots with Israel and America. You know, they're basically outsourcing, subcontracting the occupation, brutalizing the Palestinians on behalf of the Israelis. That's a serious problem. So and the Palestinians know it. It's not like this is news. I don't think the Jewish communities are clear on who's who on the other side. The other side isn't Abbas, and he's the henchman for the Israelis doing his dirty work. Their dirty work.
I might take one more question from anybody who's not had a go, otherwise I'll give somebody who's already had a go. So, where?
Good.
So, sorry. Yeah. Then, gentleman in the corner there.
Okay. Can I ask or do I need to? I'm not involved, maybe I'm a bit naive, but before I say that, I want to make a commentary. I was in India in one of the ashram I see so many disillusioned Israeli boys and girls after their service trying to ease their psychological tensions. A lot of them are all broken. That is the result of fight in the army. Coming back, I'm not involved, but having heard it time again, more or less the same topic, nothing has moved. I mean, if you are still alive, I think in 50 years, 100 times, you'll be still selling the same product, and there won't be the problem is the West, the Americans are so strong with the Israeli lobby. Yes, you can describe that there could be certain moves that will change it. The UN declaration and all that, where has it gone? Nothing. And they will still be the same, I can bet you, in 50 or 100 years' time. So, while you are saying that there will be some hopes, I think would be the best is, I mean...
Let me answer just the first part of your question. You mentioned the Israeli soldiers. Shall I keep going?
Oh yeah, just answer that question.
Okay. The Israeli soldiers are interesting. When I watch a lot of the videos, sadly I have to see a lot of them, the brutalising of the Palestinians, I wonder how these nice Jewish kids can do this. But many of them have now joined a group called Breaking the Silence, who are former IDF. I went on a tour with them and I met Yehuda Shaul, who was one of the leaders. They later, interestingly, looked back. One of them explained how he was showing videos to his parents after he left the service. And suddenly he saw what he was doing and he broke down crying, talking about it. It hadn't occurred to him. Rampaging through Palestinian houses, brutalising Palestinians. The Breaking Silence people are former IDF soldiers that are now exposing what they were doing, and they're very interesting and revealing. Why the others do what they do, I frankly have trouble understanding, but maybe that's an increasing shift as well, where there's a limit to how far you can get young people to do the things to children and to unarmed civilians, which they're doing. So just on the soldier issue, you might hope that there's some shift in that, which is what the Breaking Silence guys are trying to do. Yehuda Shaul and...
but a lot of them are having psychological problems. Well, there's a lot of them,
Well, so they should.
Smoking pot or don't know what.
Well, you're thinking psychological problems from doing the terrible things that they do.
Yeah.
Look, I'm going to take 30 seconds to try and summarise this. 200 years ago, one of your philosopher friends, more than that, called Immanuel Kant, wrote an essay called Towards Perpetual Peace, and he argued that if we did violence to planet Earth, we had no chance of establishing peace between the nations. That this was an identical issue. And when you think that I mean, you talked about 100 years' time. There are not 100 years. I mean, half of Europe's on a blaze at the moment. So the violence associated with this genuine existential threat to life on Earth has the potential to say, for God's sake, stop all these other forms of violence, whether it's Ukraine or Somalia or wherever, or Israel, Palestine, because there's another war which we're in the middle of, that in Kant's terms is no different, because it's about the fascination with violence that has mostly given men, almost entirely men, their sense of identity, usually men in uniform, for centuries, until we debunk and demystify that and say, look, there is an existential threat that we have to deal with tomorrow, and it's no different from ploughing arms into Ukraine or arming the Israelis. I mean, the irony on the news yesterday was the noise about Iran getting nuclear weapons, largely led by governments with nuclear weapons. Anyway, that's enough from me. I just wanted to say to correct you on one issue, and that is that you said you'd been on a soapbox. Peter, you were not on a soapbox. You've given us this afternoon a very impressive, empirical, historical presentation. I'm sorry, I'm the guilty person who had to cut you off. And in a way, we ought to invite you back. But on behalf of Politics in the Pub on a Sunday afternoon, thank you very much.